name is Jess Scheer. I'm the executive editor here at IOFM, and it is my honor and privilege to welcome you to the Winter 2022 Financial Operations Summit hosted by IOFM. We know how busy you are. You're just coming up from air from the 1099 season, from year-end close, and to spend the better part of the next couple of days with us is a true privilege on our part, and so we take that seriously. As a thank you for your time, want to let you know that everyone here is already a winner. Everyone attending today's sessions, including the one that you're currently listening to me on, will receive a $5 Starbucks card as a thank you for attending. You'll also be entered for one of 50 Amazon gift cards. But wait, there's more. Throughout each of the next couple of days, we've got additional thank you prizes. If you attend tomorrow, you'll get 20% off new or upgraded IOFM membership, masterclasses, or certifications, and be entered to win one of 5 $150 Target gift cards. If you join us on Thursday, you'll receive a $10 Amazon gift card. Everyone that joins us will do so, and you'll be entered to win one of 2 250 Williams-Sonoma gift cards. And as a special bonus, if you join us for all 3 days, you'll get a $25 DoorDash gift card. We know how valuable your time is, and we just want to thank you in advance for spending time with us. If you have any technical issues during this session or throughout the next couple of days, please use the chat feature. Let us know what issues you're having, and someone from IOFM will deal with your challenges right away. The 2 most common ways to fix your problem are A, making sure your speaker is on and the volume's turned up, or refreshing your page. If you're still having issues, you can email us additionally at iofmvirtual@iofm.com. We also encourage you to ask questions throughout the presentation. Please type your questions into the chat box and hit send throughout all of our sessions. We'll have live discussions throughout our sessions. Speaking of sessions, we are packed for the next 3 days with great demos, kickoffs, roundtables, discussions, town hall meetings, and I can't think of a better way to kick those off than with a discussion from my good friend Matt Tillman at OpenEnvoy. Understanding what the key considerations are when making strategic digital investments is key before understanding anything that you do going forward. So without further ado, Matt, it's up to you. What are the key things we should be considering?
Thanks for the intro, Jess. I always love following cash prizes, by the way. That's fantastic. So let me switch over here to my screen. So just a bit of a background for everybody before we get into this. A bit of context. Over the past 25 years, I have implemented ERP. I have purchased statement reconciliation engines. I've spent millions of dollars of quite literally my own money on AP automation over the past 25 years, both as a software engineer and as an owner of several businesses. And so while I own an AP automation company called OpenEnvoy, which I'm happy to talk about and link at any other time, that's not what this conversation is going to be about. Instead, we're going to talk about some of the 5 key considerations for digital investments. And the reason we're going to do that is because especially when you're both buying and when you're selling software like this, you start to see patterns emerge from customers that are really savvy and things that they think about early and often in the buying process, and also things that you think about early and often in the selling process to match that customer need. And so a long-winded way of saying we're going to go through effectively a checklist of things that you might not normally think about when you're purchasing software, making digital investments generally, especially surrounding automation. Not specifically what we do necessarily, but surrounding automation generally in the space. So we are going to have time for Q&A. So if you have questions, please feel free to put them in the chat window, and Jess will alert me because I can't readily see them. And then we'll take some time to answer questions at the very end as well. And we're going to really think about this from a couple of different directions. But the first is, I started developing software in the mid 90s. It was very much about converting paper into data for the types of systems that were becoming available at the time. So you saw large BPOs pop up to really focus on, scanning and making sure that, that the data was actually high quality and valuable. We saw a move, this transition over the past, I'd say 20 years to robotic process automation. That started very, customized, in-house, coded, et cetera, to the automated robot generation platforms that exist today. And then what we're looking for is kind of this transition to the future of finance, what we call future finance, which is real-time machine decisioning. So you're no longer, necessarily inputting data and then just making sure that you can run rules on those data, but on that data set, but the systems themselves are evaluating that data and then making key decisions based on that data. So we're going to talk a little bit about that. Number one, in the early days, it was mostly get the paper information into data so that we can make actionable decisions. We can receive actionable insights. This is why you saw a proliferation of BI tools in the late 90s and early 2000s. Eventually, you saw robotic process automation come in and take that data and make use of it. So to take action on that information. And that spanned the gamut from, custom code writing robotic process automation on data warehouses and ERP tools, clear into what it is in more modern times, which is mostly self-serve RPA processes. But some of the challenges that come along with that are there's a lot of manual processes at the very beginning in order to get that process to work. And even to get RPA to work, you had to have a lot of usually manual quality assurance and data manipulation to get that to work. Potentially complex workflows. So, generic RPA solutions are trying to be, literally everything to everyone. And a lot of times that generates complex workflows that aren't necessarily made specifically for your team. And then, of course, if you're doing statement reconciliation or something like that, today, one of the most obvious choices is to use either an in-house dispute resolution team or a third-party dispute resolution team, and that means recovery post-payments. You've already spent the capital, and that's something that RPA doesn't really take care of usually. And then finally, the cost to your business is time, confidence, money, et cetera, right? And I'm sure many of you on the call have felt those pains before, especially on the treasury side. So what we mean when we say future finance, we mean real-time reconciliation, real-time payments, and real-time decisioning. And by decisioning, we literally mean machines making decisions for users, such as geocode classification, fraud detection, et cetera, and alerting and notifying users, even of dispute resolution processes. So when we talk about future finance, we really mean true end-to-end automation. And we're starting to see systems pop up that promise that at least. And so we're going to go through a number of questions and answers about how to evaluate those systems, because today your environment looks more like this than a fully automated future finance environment, which is understandable. Most companies are still in this stage where they've made a commitment to digitization, and now they're trying to figure out exactly which systems are best to implement, the best bang for the buck early on, before hitting diminishing returns. So here are kind of 5 key considerations for digital investments. The first is, and somewhat intuitively, financial return on the investment. This actually depends heavily on the team that you're working with to partner with in terms of financial automation. But it starts kind of at the top line. A lot of companies have a really hard time figuring out how much return should I actually expect. This is actually one of the biggest challenges when you're buying software or purchasing a service. You're trying to figure out how much money am I actually going to make? How many dollars am I going to save? What's the actual ROI? Some industry numbers that we use in terms of return on investment, kind of 10 to 1 on the software side. So if you purchase software to implement in your company and to increase operational efficiency, to reduce that operational workflow, things of that nature, you should be around a 10 to 1 return on investment within that first year. And then on the service side, you should look at about a 3 to 1. So if you have processes or tools in place today, and you're looking to upgrade those processes with outsourced services, you should expect about a 3 to 1 on that, because professional services obviously are billed in a very different way. But it's really key to just have an understanding of what those averages are. And then obviously anything over, 2 or 3 to 1 is probably valuable, but it's important to just kind of understand what the market looks like. This is another aspect that companies don't always look at, which is the total cost of ownership. Oftentimes they'll look at the upfront price and they'll think about an upfront price, and they won't think about, okay, how much is this actually going to cost me year 2, year 3? What are the consulting fees that go along with this? How much training should I have to pay for? Things of that nature. You just think about that as your team grows and as your business grows. Does the cost grow with that, or does it stay fixed over time? And then, the opposite side of that is, does the ROI improve over time, or does it shrink over time? I think this is one of the big challenges facing a lot of companies in this, with this particular need is how does our return on investment look year 1, year 2, year 3, et cetera. And then finally, the thing that's interesting on the financial side that actually it turns out it matters quite a bit, because you see a lot of different options in the space, especially today, a lot of different options in space. So I think you have to think about, what type of investors does the vendor have? And the reason we say that is, and the reason I've looked at that in the past myself, is because the smaller investors, the more leverage you'll have, potentially the shorter period of existence that they'll have, right? So you have to be concerned about that. As you start to go upstream, you start to evaluate the types, the quality level of the investors on the back end, and then are they held to quarterly metrics? And this matters from a position of negotiating leverage for the business themselves. It matters in terms of how much they're going to spend on research and development. So the kind of product that you're going to end up with in year 3 is very different if you go with a company that's going to spend 60 to 80% of its total assets on developing technology for you, the customer, versus a public company which is going to spend a far lower percentage, which of course will still be a much larger amount usually than the smaller company. So just think about that in the process, in your buying process, and you will be surprised at just how much return on investment you can achieve in a short period of time, depending on that type of the answer that the vendor has, obviously, or what you can discover on your own. So don't discard that. Most people don't think about it, but it is really valuable. Business impact, huge to think about. Who is the buyer of this system? Like, this is the thing that a lot of ERP solutions fail on, because it's such a big ticket item. No one really wants to be the person signing. Everyone wants ERP, but everybody knows that's like a long-term implementation and no one really wants to sign on the dotted line. So you've really got to nail down, even in your own organization, who the buyer is, who's actually signing this thing. Everybody wants the idea of end-to-end ERP, but it takes real commitment to fit the bill. And so think about that, number one. Then second, who needs the solution versus who could use the solution. I think there's so many times where I was buying software that everybody in the room was like, oh, we could use it for X and we could use it for Y. And what that does is it increases the scope, increases the amount of implementation time, and reduces your time to value. So it's actually more important that you get something in there that you can trust quickly into that particular team, so you can start realizing value and then building out adoption organically. Some solutions work really well for this, others do not. Others will not even sell in that way. So you really need to think about that up front. And then think about how it really impacts the metrics of the business. Like, does it increase margins, revenue? Like, what does this actually do? And that's a really big thing that most customers are thinking about. Oh, this greatly reduces the amount of time I'm working on X, Y, and Z. And they're not really thinking about, does that lead to an increase in margin? How is your business valued? Are you, PE-backed, EBITDA flip sort of business? How does that matter? How does that affect your revenue multiples? How does that affect your EBITDA multiples? So these are very important things to think about in the buying decision of large software packages and large automation packages. It also helps you build a case for the internal buyer if you are the champion. So it's very important. And then, does the solution require your customers or vendors to do extra work? I've seen so many solutions in the AV automation space that require perhaps more work out of your vendors. And so that's a fine concept if you have leverage over your vendors and you know that they will sort of play ball, you know that they will accept that training. How much does training cost for a vendor? How much does that reduce your relationship, the amount of leverage you have with that vendor over time? So you really have to think about that type of thing. I think I always tell customers, and even when I was buying, I always said, I want our vendors to have to do the least amount of work, right? Our vendors should find this to be incredibly easy to work with, because if they don't, I'm not going to get the best price. My procurement team's going to be upset, so on and so forth. So I think it's really important you think about, how much work does this require people that act on behalf of my business, my partners. Finally, we talk about time commitment, and this is a really, really important thing to think about, obviously, when it comes to ERPs, AP automation generally, et cetera. I think one of the things that companies run into a lot is, we've purchased this package, we like our partner, they've taken us out to football games, et cetera, like everything's great. And then you're like, 9 months becomes 9 months, becomes 12 months, becomes 18 months. And I've seen the first ERP implementation I ever purchased and integrated was a very large package by a very well-known firm that everybody knows, definitely a top 2. And it was disastrous. People lost their jobs over the timeline to implement that ERP package. And so think about the solution. Can it be implemented in stages? It's the most important concept. Can it be implemented for the team that's going to receive the highest ROI in the shortest period of time? And can it be adopted over time? Because almost every vendor in AP automation or ERP will tell you our solution can eventually do that if you wait long enough. Right? And you don't want to foot the bill for waiting. That's the really important thing to understand about implementation stages. Does the solution provider charge extra for professional services? This is really key. Different types of business models in the space are emerging. I think with the traditional older, ERP, AP automation vendors, most of them will say, yes, they charge extra for professional services. They'll say it's a pass through, and say, et cetera, et cetera. They'll charge a lot for integrations. We've seen bills for certain providers up to $150,000 for integrations, just ERP integrations. These are one-time costs. They are not recurring. However, by doing that as a separate bill, you can book it differently, but you may not find that the partnership is incentivized to maximize the return on investment. In fact, it's usually incentivized to increase the professional services fees. This is also tied unintuitively, until you realize how they're valued, with the types of investors they have. So if you find that there's public or private equity investors, oftentimes you're going to see professional services account for a larger percentage of the billing line item, or what's called NRR, non-recurring revenue. With recurring revenue, it's great in terms of predictability, et cetera. And then in terms of professional services, like they're constantly updating the software, et cetera, for the customer. However, you are part of their roadmap and their pipeline. So you have to think about what percentage of, how tight is the partnership basically in determining, when those features will be added for you and how reports will be generated, et cetera. So just really evaluate, what the turnaround times are going to be on development if you're thinking about something that's like a more recurring sort of service. And then, was the solution designed reasonably? This is the biggest thing. I have purchased some awful ERP products because they've been around forever and they're stable, and I know they're not going away. And then it takes probably, 3 months longer to train people on how to actually use it and to not create errors. So you really have to think about, like, what are you going to prioritize as an organization? Fast time to ramp, especially with the changing landscape in the AP departments today, that's become more of a concern. Like, how fast can your team be trained? How quickly can they be onboarded? And are there dedicated resources for that process at the vendor, no matter if it's professional services or not? There's a lot of changes going on in even the tech labor landscape right now that you need to think about. So really focus on something that you want to work in, because you will be spending time in these solutions, and you want to make sure it's something that you want to work in. And then I always say you should achieve time to value in less than 3 weeks, or less than 4 weeks, sorry. Depending on the size of the solution, it can be at the end of that or sooner than that. But if it's going to be 6 months for you to receive your first, sort of value, your first ROI, you're doing it wrong. they're doing it wrong, you're doing it wrong. And it's really important that you push on these short timelines to value, which will cause the vendor to focus in terms of scope. It will cause your team to focus in terms of scope, and just start, generating margin effectively within the AP teams, or the AP or AR teams, your finance teams generally. So super important. You're aggressive and fast with timelines. Finally, organizational risk. This is something that's painfully obvious if you've been through a few of these ERP implementations. I think a lot of people don't like to talk about the reality of organizational risk with AP automation generally, things of that nature. So matching services, reconciliation services, et cetera. But these are big commitments that you're making. You want to be able to partner with a vendor that's willing to accept some of that risk versus transfer that risk entirely to the customer, right? Because that creates an actual partnership. And so there's two really painful pieces right up front. You're going to see personnel changes in these types of implementation. You're going to see people get so sick of whatever you chose, they're going to quit eventually. You're going to see the downside, the negative, as well as the positive. The positive is you should be receiving massive amounts of ROI. The downside is if you don't, and if you're waiting too long to implement something, or if you're not getting, negotiating opt-outs, and you're not, doing the right things on the contract side, you're going to see personnel changes. And I think I've never seen an ERP implementation that ends with 100% of the team that got there, right? We've seen AP implementations all the time, really fast. They can be really fast to onboard, especially, payment solutions, because they're effectively commoditized at that stage, the payment rails. You've seen those solutions be adopted very quickly. But when you think about the larger the system and the more you bite off as a team and the less you think about scope early on and collaboration early on, you're going to see those later on. And I think a lot of that comes from at the beginning of a project, everyone thinks, oh, I could use this. And then no one wants to sign up and commit to it. And you start to see collaboration go to confrontation a lot towards the end of these projects. So I think that's sort of the downside. So make sure you get those upfront questions answered by each of those vendors. Super important. And with that, I'll say, the biggest and the final piece, and this is oddly enough, this is what people start with versus what they should actually start with in the conversation. They think about, well, how much is this thing going to cost me? How much does it cost me to go to, let's say AP automation in 4 to 6 weeks, et cetera? How much does it cost me? That is probably the last thing you should look at, because you're a finance team, and finance teams know that everything's about an ROI in reality. So if you're making 10 million and you only have to spend 1, you should do it all day long. And so to think about financial commitment, maybe a little bit of a different way, which is what percentage of your budget on an annual basis is dedicated to automation, is dedicated to less risk in your business over time versus more business risk over time, which is what we're really talking about when we talk about automation. What about your competitors? I've talked to so many customers, couldn't tell me who their competitors are. They know generally the size of the company, et cetera, that would be their competitor. But in terms of their competitors, if they're smaller, they're outspending you on automation. They're spending more of their budget not having to, poach people at your company. So they're running faster. So think about how much faster your competitors are running, what they're spending. The percentage of spend model versus committed capital. So when you think about, what sort of business model you're going to back in terms of your vendor selection, is it a percent of spend model? Percent of spend model has been around forever. I'm going to save you X amount of dollars. You're going to pay me Y amount of dollars as part of that, as a percentage of that. It is unauditable. If you have given them your data to recover costs that you have spent, when it's a percentage of spend, in order to audit whether or not they're charging you correctly, you actually have to audit every charge that they've ever paid or evaluated on your behalf. So just think about that. You've given up your leverage, and mathematically, it's very challenging for you to find out whether or not they charge you the right amount. Is it committed capital? So think about that over the period of time. Like, how much of a commitment is it? Is it a monthly growing commitment? Is it transactional? Is it variable? What sort of accounting problems are you going to have purchasing from your vendor? So a lot of companies don't think about that ahead of time. They need to think about, Usually predictability is big, obviously, for financial departments. Predictability in spend with the vendor and predictability in results from the vendor. Certainly at the C-suite, they tend to value predictability. And is the solution automation or professional services in disguise? Probably the biggest challenge. So if you think about what is the financial commitment, these systems can go anywhere from, let's say, the lowest end systems, maybe going for maybe 50,000 a year, right? Higher end system going for several $1 million a year. Think about what percentage of that is product that you're buying and what percentage of that is training, conferences, professional services, et cetera. And you can often see in public companies how much of a line item professional services are by looking at how their revenue is valued. So think about that in terms of financial commitment. If you're going to spend hundreds or even millions, hundreds of thousands or even millions of dollars, as I have spent in the past, think about what you're actually paying for. Are you actually paying for product? Certainly, you're not trying to do this in-house, usually as a company, unless you are a technology company. Most of the time, you're finding outside vendors. So find out what type of vendor it is and what you're paying for. Is it $75 an hour for professional services? If so, if that's double billed, what kind of team are you getting? Like, what kind of technical competence are you really bringing into your ERP? Is it 150? Is it 250? Are you buying engineers that are, could easily get a job at Google? Like, what kind of professional services are you getting? And is it mostly that or mostly something else? So I think those are big components of this. What you should receive at the end of this is, number one, clean structured data. No matter what solution you buy, you should not have to clean the data yourself. Number one. Number two is it should be fully automated. And I mean fully automated. In modern times, you don't need to have unautomated solutions or 50% automated or anything like that. This should be fully automated and then fully integrated into your back office, your existing workflow, your existing structure. You should not have to buy something in a modern time unless you're replacing your entire ERP that causes you to change all of your organizational processes. You need to think about how the organization is impacted. You need to think about what the processors are the new processes are going to be, but you shouldn't have to change 100% of everything in order to adopt a solution and also start to receive ROI. But it is very important you nail down probably processes before you go into this, so you at least know what your baseline is and you know how it's improving over time. That's something we didn't say earlier, but it's something we highly recommend. And I'll leave you with just a couple of thoughts. The first is, it is mathematically impossible to build any large business without automation. I don't care what kind of company you are, it is absolutely impossible to build and scale with the margin requirements that are of the public markets in modern times. Just absolutely impossible. And so what you also should think about is everyone else that you know, everyone else that you don't know, your competitors, everyone's going through the same thing. Everyone's trying to digitize very quickly because they see there's a cliff coming where you just won't be able to hire enough people to solve these problems. And so what I like to say is no longer AP automation, AR automation, financial operations is no longer a human scale problem, right? Those days are over. There's far too much demand on the business for that. So with that, we've got some time left for questions.
We do. Matt, thank you so much. This has been incredibly eye-opening. I think I can't think of a better way to kick off our session than to have the ideas that you shared. Just a couple quick questions, and then we'd love to take questions from the audience. So please, we love all your good morning comments, but also if you have questions for Matt, please include those in the chat window as well. So you mentioned that there's about a 4-week, or there could be as little as 4 weeks between implementation and on ROI, but let's take a step back before that. How much time realistically is involved from discovery of a new technology to, say, implementation?
Yeah, so discovery of a new technology, you're going to look at, buying cycles usually depend. Actually, here's a metric on the vendor side. It's interesting. So vendors typically don't like to sell products to customers for any less than $75,000 per month that it takes them to sell the product. It's usually roughly what it is. So if the customer is a large customer, $1.8 million deal, you expect it to be an 18-month sales cycle, roughly. That's kind of how you gauge that. On the customer side of things, you have to do your diligence, and there is a wild landscape of solutions out there. And so I think it's really important that in your diligence, it can take 6 months to figure it out. It can take, 3-month budget cycle to figure out whether or not the firm is going to support your budget. And then by the time you get to your budget cycle, your budget process, that solution is probably increased in price. Labor costs have increased in price. So I think the tighter the window, the better it is for both the customer and the vendor. I'd say the other thing that happens is most people get really distracted when they're buying these systems and start to think about every use case versus the highest value use case. We've seen customers never met them before, sign up, purchase the product within 30 days, and they're live within 35 days. That is a really aggressive time frame, but it's from a customer who knew specifically what they wanted and could vet all the things that we talked about in this checklist kind of before even having that initial couple of conversations. I'd say the other thing that I'd recommend is negotiate a POC that's baked into the contract, because the POC will be a lot better and a lot faster. And so you can start to see a 2-week POC versus the traditional 90 days. And so you're looking at those sorts of turnaround times. But yeah, we've met a customer, signed the customer, and these are, $250,000 deal. And then within 2 days, they're receiving value of the system. But again, that's because we're in the AP automation side. So it's a little bit different than obviously if you're picking a large, AR and ERP package as well, or something like that.
Thanks. So we've got about 14 minutes, and we'll have to do a quick fire round because questions are coming in fast and furious. Pamela just asked, how do you best manage the process when management wants something in place now?
Yeah, I've been the management that wants something in place now. And so I think here's what you do. You look at reducing your risk throughout the process as fast as possible. So you go and you find, let's say the top 8 Gartner vendors for whatever you're looking for. You connect with each one of those, you get demos as fast as possible. You get the intro call out of the way. You help them qualify you as a customer, number one. You get the demo out of the way really quickly. And you tell management it's going to be like, listen, this is going to be a 3 to 4 week process for us to evaluate, right? Management's usually going to be fine with a 1-month process to evaluate AP automation or AR automation usually. Maybe not so much with ERP. There might be a little bit more song and dance depending on the size of your company. But I'd say that's step number 1. So you get management to agree to that time frame. The next piece is, as you get in those intro calls, you get the vendor to do a demo with your data. Because it will shorten the period of time you need on the POC, because you can actually already interact with the platform with your data. So that's like step number 2. Step number 3 is you find a contract or an order form with a particular vendor, whichever vendor you like the best. Sign the order form or sign the contract with a 90-day opt-out, which means there's no skin. Nobody's looking for a new job at the end of the thing if it doesn't go right. And you can usually find out within 2, 3, 4 weeks if it's going to go well. So negotiate that up front. And then that way you're not committing, even though you're giving the vendor, a 12-month price or an 18-month, whatever your terms are, doesn't matter. You're still getting that, window. And even if it's 30 days for your particular project, still a good enough window for you to decide whether or not you want to back out. It also puts the vendor through their paces as to whether or not the tech chops they have match what the salesperson told you in the intro call. It's really, really important. And so that's what I would do to reduce your risk and also give management what they're looking for.
Absolutely. One of the things that you've mentioned that I just want to dig a little bit deeper on is this is not a people scalable challenge, right? One of the things that we're seeing broadly, and I'll be talking about this more during a benchmarking session tomorrow, is the Great Resignation is affecting AP departments as much as any other industry. And so you're dealing with 2 sets of challenges. You're dealing with folks that are leaving because they're burned out. You're dealing with folks that are leaving because they're approaching retirement age. That's north of 50% of your staff. And so it's really difficult to keep throwing bodies at challenges. Automation, particularly with short turnarounds, becomes vital. So I think this has been a great way to kick this off. Kara wants to know, can you explain how OCR alternatives work?
Yeah. Yeah. So, okay. So a few things there. I'm not sure how much this person knows about my background, so I'll just give everybody a little bit of context. So I have background in computer vision, which is a type of machine learning specifically geared towards analyzing and understanding imagery, and it can be imagery and video imagery, still imagery as well, and a couple patents in the space. So I'm pretty familiar with OCR, needless to say. So OCR has gone through a million iterations over the past, couple of decades. And I think the first thing is there's geometry OCR, which is I draw boxes around things and say the things in those boxes are X. There's inference OCR, which takes the text data as an example, runs it through filter processes, vision filter processes, and then runs it through text processes to make sure that these words are actually words, which is why OCR is geared towards specific languages. So that's kind of the baseline for what OCR is. What you find is OCR is maybe 53% accurate out of the box, just to throw out a number. And then business people will talk about OCR as being 85% accurate with QA. The reality is there's no single number for accuracy in machine learning. You basically have true positives and false positives. So you have what's called something you can map on what's called an ROC curve. So the midpoint on the ROC curve is usually what people talk about in terms of accuracy. So on the accuracy side, the thing you'll normally get is vendors that say, oh, we're high 90s accuracy. And there's two problems with that. The first is you had to do a lot of work internally to get that OCR to work. So now your AP department has been retrained as OCR training people, which is probably not what they were hired for. So that's step number one. So you want to offload OCR training and templates and all that stuff to an outside vendor as fast as possible anyways. Don't just buy OCR and then just deal with it. The second component is OCR actually doesn't stay at that accuracy level because of how you have to retrain the models constantly. So what you're going to want to do is you're going to want to look for a solution that doesn't require you to use OCR. They might use OCR in the back end. We actually started with OCR, and then we use a number of layers on top of that we don't discuss because of our inability to patent things in the US, thanks to the Alice ruling. However, there are other systems like at Google and Facebook and LinkedIn. They don't use, just OCR out of the box. There's a number of other layers that kind of most of us use, I think, and they're really from the search industry, a lot of those layers. And so if you're buying an OCR solution, you're wondering why it's not accurate, don't worry, it's not you, or rather it's you and you just can't throw enough bodies at the problem of generating templates. That's another way to think about it. But OCR free solutions are going to become more common. I mean, we're not the first, certainly at OpenEnvoy, but we take on the burden of the fact that those additional layers are expensive to manage and expensive to have up and online and support, especially with the growing cost of GPU cards in the pandemic. So it actually comes down to a chip level if you want to get into that high 97, 95, 97% plus accuracy. The other component that I'll say on OCR free solutions, they need to have QA built in, because if they don't have QA built in, 1%, we work with large companies, 1% of $1 billion is still a pretty decent sized number. Right. And so you want to make sure that you're not 1% inaccurate when it comes to financial data before it goes into an okay to pay solution. So that's kind of my background on that. There are a few layers. You can do Google searches and find some of the most common layers like Ngram and things like that. But most companies won't talk about how it actually works internally. I think just as a vendor, make sure that they have the QA service built in for you, no matter which vendor you're going with.
Interesting. Aisha has a couple questions, so I'll try to get and group hers together for one. She's dealing with companies that provide invoices, I'm reading between the lines here, in multiple languages. And so can OCR work learning multiple languages?
Yes, certainly. I mean, OCR it's character recognition, and it can be trained to recognize characters in really any language that I've ever found. But usually what happens is OCR starts to fail the less that it sees a particular language and less of a vocabulary it has access to. And so usually, OCR solutions probably not best for financial services, and they're most widely used in financial services, sadly, but that's kind of how it goes. So I'd say, yes, you should be able to get a solution. I mean, I think we accept something like 13 languages, 8 out of the box, 5 trainable or something like that. Oh, wow. And that's mostly because we don't use OCR, so we can be up and running really quickly on those versus OCR solutions. I mean, we don't really use OCR too much.
Well, I've got another OCR question for you anyway, if you don't mind.
Yeah, no, I know a lot about it. We just decided it wasn't good enough.
Yeah, this is great to tap your brain. Can OCR work with collecting outstanding AR invoices as well?
Collecting outstanding is an interesting, I mean, collection is workflow. So I think what they mean is on the AR side and AP side, both. Can it be used to extract data from those invoices? And the answer is yes. But it would require a lot of workflow for the actual collection process, assuming that they mean the collection process is separate and that an OCR vendor is saying that they can, collect on their behalf. They would use humans to collect on their behalf right. in that instance.
We had to make some assumptions there. So if there's anything that needs to be clarified, please follow up. We've got about 5 more minutes. And Matt, I'm going to put you on the spot. Any questions we don't get around to, or you find answering offline?
Yes, yeah, absolutely. Just shoot me an email. I'm happy to answer them.
Great. So another question from Aisha. She keeps hearing about proprietary tools for data compilation, but all I see is companies using Excel VHX lookups and formulas. Even after the scrub data is received, we still have to scrub that data. Any suggestions?
Yes. Yeah, I mean, I think the vendor you selected was probably using OCR, would be my first comment. But I think, so here's the thing, in modern financial automation, you should be able to have fully digitized documentation and then API access for that digitized documentation. So you should have 100% access to the data underlying anything you pass through that system immediately. Should have that available in as near real time as you need in financial automation. So that's number one. In terms of lookups and extraction tools and things like that, like any ETL process, once you get it into your back office, is usually going to be because the nomenclature needs to be mapped to whatever your internal nomenclature is. So like the customer says, the provider, vendor, customer, whoever it is on that side says P.O, and you need to translate that into purchase order as an example. That tends to happen inside of large companies because they have nomenclature that's far more complicated than PO to purchase order, obviously. And then they have geocodes, et cetera. So that's the type of thing that you look, normally companies will do. I think with more modern solutions, if you're buying, if you were buying our solution, you're buying someone else's solution, we're going to normalize that data for you. And that data is going to be piped directly into your back office in exactly the way, the shape that you want versus the shape that the vendor is used to. So that, by the way, just to dive into that a little bit and maybe take a couple of assumptions, but usually when you buy an off-the-shelf tool to process documents, you're going to have to do a ton of work, right? If you partner with a vendor who takes those documents and makes them actionable and then is able to do two-way syncs with your back office in real time and doesn't need to ask you for a spreadsheet of GL codes as an example and things of that nature, then you're not going to have to do any of that work. The work that you're going to do is mostly going to be around analyzing the data, finding out, where you overspent or where you were overbilled, depending on the type of transaction it is. And you're going to be focused on more of the forensic, like how can I recover, or how can I bill properly? So the actual work, the investigative work versus the munging of data, as it's often referred to.
The next question comes from Tanya, and I actually have a question for her to clarify. So if you could clarify, then we'll follow up. But her question in big picture is it advisable for a public health department to invest in automation? My question for her is, why wouldn't it be? But do you have a thought specifically on public health departments or government entities in particular?
Yeah, so they have a different buying process that they have to follow, obviously,
Sure.
on the government side, and so it can be kind of complex. So I think what you should do is before you go through the asking for money part internally, which can be brutal in government organizations. A lot of friends of mine actually have startups into the government, into the defense industry and to healthcare as well. So it can be very expensive to just go through that process. So I think internally what you can do is you can take a look at what the market looks like, what the landscape looks like, what your expectations are, and then find out if each one of those vendors can even handle public health, because most of them won't have the certifications required to be able to handle public health. And then also, are they willing to do deals, contingent deals on achieving whatever you need them to achieve in terms of data structure, et cetera, ahead of time? You get kind of that wrapped up ahead of time. You get the package, the full cost, and then you present it as a full package cost before you run the RFP, which of course has to go across multiple vendors anyways, but you just will know more ahead of time in terms of the range of cost for your particular solution. So it is important. There will be fewer and fewer people working in those jobs over time. Just like Jess referred to with the Great Resignation, people love government pensions and will start taking them sooner and sooner, is my guess. And so it's worth investing in automation, but it's also because of the complexity around your buying process. You really have to do a little bit more legwork up front, more research up front than on the back end, sadly.
Great. Matt, thank you so much. This has been an incredibly inspiring session. I think really sets the tone. If you have any other questions, please include them in future chat windows. Our next session starts in 15 minutes. Thanks for everyone's attention.
Bye-bye.